If you're new here, welcome to Dark Side of the NFL. Subscribe now if you want more truth, more investigations, and more stories the league would rather keep buried. The story of pain in the NFL doesn't begin with injuries, but with silence, stitched between helmets and contracts. A silence heavy enough to crush truth, yet light enough to be carried from locker room to locker room. Players step onto the field wrapped in expectation. But beneath the pads lives a reality no camera captures. Pain becomes currency, traded for loyalty. And loyalty becomes the very chain that binds them. Doctors walk the sidelines with bags full of answers. Answers designed not to heal but to prolong the show. Inside those bags live tiny white pills, marked by pharmaceutical blessing and institutional approval. The league calls it treatment. But those who swallowed them know a different name. The pills promised strength at the cost of identity, clarity at the cost of dependency. Every Sunday, pain became a ritual. Every Monday, addiction became a routine. In the NFL, hurting is normal, and numbing is mandatory. Behind the cheers, the banners, the fireworks, there is a pain no replay will ever show. The kind that doesn't bleed, but still destroys. The kind that doesn't break bones, but breaks lives. And somewhere in that space between agony and denial, the epidemic began to grow. Not as a secret, but as a system. Not as a mistake, but as a method. A carefully engineered pattern, designed to protect the shield at any cost. Players signed contracts without reading the invisible ink. The ink that said their bodies were currency, their futures negotiable, their suffering expandable. And on the day they took their first painkiller, the cycle quietly began. A cycle built not on healing, but on survival. A cycle the league knew too well, and chose never to stop. Because pain in the NFL is not an obstacle. It is part of the business model. White heavy checkmark pain in professional football is not a possibility. It is a guarantee written into every snap. Players don't ask if they will hurt, only how much. Their bodies become battlegrounds long before the opening kickoff. Bones scream under the weight of expectation. Ligaments tear under the pressure of living dreams. And every hit becomes a memory carved into tissue. In other professions, pain is a warning. In the NFL, it is ignored until it becomes unbearable. But unbearable doesn't stop games. It doesn't change depth charts. It doesn't slow the machine. So the machine created a solution, not to heal, but to silence. Pills that masked pain so efficiently. Players believed they were invincible, even when their bodies were falling apart. They became dependent on a chemical courage, unable to distinguish strength from sedation. Physicians distributed medications like halftime speeches, with confidence, authority, and reckless assurance. No one questioned dosage. No one questioned consequences. The expectation was simple. If you can walk, you can play. If you can stand, you can hit. If you can breathe, you can bleed for the team. And even when the pain rose like floodwater, the prescription pad rose faster. Every locker room had stories. Players who took pills to sleep, pills to wake, pills to numbly drift through practice. Their bodies became laboratories. Their minds became battlegrounds, and as the league celebrated their toughness, the addiction grew quietly behind helmets and tape. Pain wasn't the enemy anymore. Feeling was. And the pills made sure players didn't feel anything at all. Before we go deeper, hit that like button. It tells YouTube this is the kind of story fans need to hear, not the one the NFL markets. White heavy checkmark, the epidemic began long before headlines exposed it. Long before retired legends confessed their struggles. It started in meeting rooms, where injuries were statistics, and treatment was a strategy, not a duty of care. The league crafted an illusion of safety, decorated with medical credentials and sideline tents. But behind the curtain lived a brutal truth. Players weren't patients, they were assets. And assets must stay functional. The pressure became a language everyone understood. Play through it. Push through it. There's no room for weakness when the world is watching. so painkillers became part of the culture. As normal as cleats, as expected as impact, as accepted as injury. Athletes who once feared the pills soon relied on them to move, to focus, to exist. What began as a necessity slowly transformed into dependency, and dependency became addiction. Some players swallowed handfuls at a time, their tolerance rising like the stakes of every game. Team officials knew, but intervention meant admitting liability, and liability meant guilt. So the league chose silence, choosing victory over well-being. The epidemic grew because no one stopped it, because stopping it meant slowing the sport, and slowing the sport to the league was unthinkable. So the players continued suffering in private, while the league thrived in public. The cheers grew louder, but so did the number of pills consumed. This is how the epidemic survived, not through secrecy, but through normalization. Painkillers did more than silence the agony. They rewired the way players understood suffering. The body screamed, but the mind learned to ignore the signal. Coaches praised the warriors who never stayed down, never limped, never flinched. But they didn't know, or didn't admit, that chemistry, not courage, prevented collapse. Players lined up for injections as casually as they laced their cleats. Toradol became a pre-game ritual, a badge of honor disguised as medical care. It numbed everything, from fractures to fear, from trauma to truth. They played like machines, because the drugs made them feel like machines. Their bodies broke in slow motion, fractures hidden beneath layers of numb determination. And when the adrenaline faded, the pain returned like a tidal wave. So they reached again for the pills. A cycle unbroken, a cycle encouraged. Team doctors were gatekeepers of relief, but also gatekeepers of destruction. They were celebrated when players returned quickly, criticized when players asked for rest. And rest was a luxury few could afford. Contracts weren't guaranteed, but pain was. Every hit compounded the suffering. Every decision deepened the addiction. Players trusted the league's medical staff, not knowing their loyalty was divided between player well-being and organizational expectation. The pills blurred the line between injury and endurance, between survival and obedience. Players became compliant soldiers, following orders masked as treatment. And while the world celebrated their toughness, the league quietly celebrated their silence. This was not recovery. This was management. Management of pain. Management of people. Management of truth. White heavy checkmark behind every Sunday highlight reel. Lived the private battles no fan witnessed. Athletes went home to dark rooms, where the pain returned with vengeance. The pills that once offered freedom became chains wrapped around their evenings, their nights, their futures. What began in the facility followed them into their homes, their pockets, their bloodstream. Some players hid their addiction like injuries, something to tape up and play through. Others spiraled quietly, lost in the chemical haze the league helped create. Sleep became impossible without medication, and waking became unbearable without more. Teammates whispered about those who struggled, but whispers never became action. Because in the NFL, admitting weakness feels like forfeiting your career. So the suffering stayed invisible, even as it consumed them. Families watched loved ones fade, behind glassy eyes and unpredictable moods. Some players lashed out, others withdrew entirely. The pills dissolved not only pain, but personality. And as dependency took root, paranoia grew alongside it. Fear of losing their roster spot, their reputation, their livelihood. Retired players later described the withdrawal as worse than any injury they had ever sustained. Cold sweats, tremors, aggression, despair. But instead of helping them transition out of the league, the system abandoned them the moment they stopped producing. The NFL's medical care ended the second they walked away from the field. But the addiction didn't end. It followed, and for many, it destroyed everything the league claimed to protect. White heavy checkmark. The deeper truth behind the epidemic is that the league understood the consequences all along. Reports circulated internally, warnings issued by medical professionals, brave enough to speak up. But warnings become irrelevant when profit outweighs ethics. A hurting player was manageable. A benched player was not. Pain management became pain suppression, and suppression became survival strategy. The league's image was pristine, and addiction didn't fit the narrative. So they buried the data, dismissed the whistleblowers, and expanded the pharmacy. Players trusted the system because they had no other option. Their careers depended on compliance, and compliance depended on medication. Team doctors distributed pills without documenting doses, without tracking frequency, without considering consequences. The average player received more opioids than many surgical patients, and still the league insisted that everything was under control. Control meant keeping players on the field, not keeping them healthy. When lawsuits later emerged, the NFL denied everything: the malpractice, the negligence, the silence. But former players told a different story, a story of being handed handfuls of pills before flights, after games, during road trips, a story of dependency cultivated by those entrusted with their care, a story of silence that protected the brand, not the bodies fueling it. The epidemic didn't grow by accident. It grew because the league let it, because the system needed it, because the machine demanded it, and players paid the price. Long after the crowd stopped cheering, white heavy checkmark, some players tried to stop, tried to pull themselves away from the chemical fog, but the withdrawal was a battle they were never prepared to fight. The body shook violently, the mind rebelled, and the world blurred into something unrecognizable. Without the pills, the pain returned with a vengeance. Pain from old fractures, torn ligaments, hidden concussions. They realized the truth too late. They were never healed. They were only muted. Many players begged for alternative treatments, but alternatives didn't guarantee playing time. And in the NFL, playing time is oxygen. Miss a week, and you risk your future. Miss 2, and you risk your career. So the pills became a familiar enemy, one they learned to depend on, just to fulfill the expectations of millions. Teammates shared bottles, like veterans sharing war stories. Some joked about the pill lines, calling them the breakfast buffet, a dark humor masking a darker truth. Others hid their addiction behind bravado and performance. But when the stadium lights turned off, the facade crumbled. They weren't chasing wins anymore. They were chasing numbness. Retired players later admitted they didn't know who they were without the chemical quiet that ruled their careers. Identity, purpose, control, all dissolved in a swirl of dependency. The league called it toughness. The media called it dedication. But those who lived it called it survival. And survival came at a cost no paycheck could ever repay. White heavy check mark. The most brutal truth of this epidemic is that addiction didn't discriminate. Superstars suffered. Rookies suffered. Veterans suffered. The overlooked and the celebrated all swallowed the same pills. Some used them to endure injury. Others used them to endure expectation. Everyone was running from something, and the pills offered the illusion of escape. At team facilities, painkillers were handed out like candy, passed from trainer to player, with barely a whisper of caution. The dosage blurred lines between treatment and dependency, and once dependency rooted itself, it grew rapidly, feeding on pressure, loneliness, fear. Players woke up groggy, sweated through practices, snapped at loved ones, lost sleep, lost appetite, lost control. But they kept playing, because the league taught them that the only unforgivable sin was stepping away. Families begged them to slow down. But slowing down meant losing everything. The culture taught them that pain was a sign of greatness. That silence was a sign of loyalty. And loyalty became the rope that pulled many toward destruction. Some retired players later confessed they didn't remember entire seasons. Their minds consumed by medication and muscle memory. The pills didn't just numb pain. They erased time. And the league continued forward, as if nothing happened, because the machine never stops, even when the bodies powering it begin to fall apart. White heavy checkmark. The lawsuits eventually arrived, carried by veterans whose bodies were collapsing under decades of abuse. They described locker rooms that felt more like pharmacies, sidelines that felt more like triage centers. They told stories of pills swallowed by the handful, injections administered without explanation, treatments recorded without consent. Their testimonies painted a picture of a league that valued availability over humanity. The NFL responded with denial, insisting their medical practices were safe, ethical, responsible. But internal documents told another story, a story of warnings ignored, risks minimized, liability avoided. The league's priority was not health. It was continuity. Contracts needed to be honored. Broadcast schedules needed to be filled. Revenue needed to flow. And if that meant players needed to be medicated into compliance, so be it. The lawsuits revealed the depth of negligence, the overprescribing, the lack of documentation, the pressure placed on medical staff to return players to the field, regardless of long-term consequences. Some former team doctors admitted they were expected to serve the organization first, the athlete second. Their duty became twisted, their oath distorted. The epidemic didn't shock them. They had seen it forming for years. And when the truth finally surfaced, the league settled quietly, paying millions without admitting fault. But money couldn't fix the damage, the broken bodies, the fractured lives. The real cost was measured in suffering that outlived careers, in futures swallowed by addiction, in families torn apart long after retirement. This was not an accident. This was the price of silence. White heavy checkmark. As the scandal deepened, the stories became more haunting, echoing through interviews like confessions from a forgotten battlefield. Players admitted they couldn't function without their daily cocktail, a blend of pills, patches, and injections designed to silence their bodies. Some couldn't climb stairs without medication. Others couldn't sleep without turning to substances stronger than anything prescribed legally. A few confessed that they hid pills around their homes, in gym bags, bathroom drawers, car glove boxes, just in case withdrawal struck unexpectedly. Their lives were no longer lived freely. They were managed, rigged, timed around chemical relief. Former teammates recalled moments when players would shake uncontrollably before games, their nerves frayed, their systems overloaded. Coaches called it adrenaline. Doctors knew better. Many players couldn't distinguish pain from withdrawal, injury from dependency, recovery from relapse. They pushed through anyway, because the league's mythology told them heroes don't break, they sacrifice. But sacrifice became a trap, one that captured countless athletes in a cycle of suffering and silence. Even after the truth emerged, many refused to speak openly, fearful of betraying the shield they had devoted their lives to. The tragedy was not just the addiction. It was the loyalty that kept them chained to it. White heavy checkmark. Behind closed doors, team physicians debated ethics, as though it were a luxury they could no longer afford. Some wanted stricter protocols, wanting players to rest, recover, heal properly. Others warned that too much caution would cost games, and games cost money. Players were assets, valuable, replaceable, expendable. The system rewarded doctors who kept players active and sidelined those who prioritized long-term health. Whispers circulated about quiet firings, med staff removed for being too careful, too protective, too honest. In this environment, medicine became negotiation, treatment became strategy, and ethics became optional. Some doctors described moments where they felt more like mechanics than healers. They fixed what needed to be fixed, just long enough for Sunday. And Sunday ruled everything. Players limped through practice, took injections in the tunnel, popped pills in the locker room, before walking out, to the roar of a crowd that never saw the hidden suffering beneath the pads. Every cheer masked a compromise. Every touchdown hid a consequence. The league's medical culture was less about wellness and more about functionality, a system designed to keep the machine running, no matter the cost. And the cost was devastating. Paid in private, paid in silence, paid in pain. Families carried the heaviest burden, watching the people they loved transform into shadows of who they once were. Wives described emotional outbursts, memory lapses, cold detachment, and unpredictable moods that felt like living with a stranger. Children wondered why their fathers were always tired, always hurting, always distant. Some players tried to hide the truth, pushing through family dinners, school events, quiet nights at home. But the addiction seeped through everything. They would leave the table just to swallow another pill, or retreat to a room to ride out the crash of medication wearing off. Relationships fractured, marriages strained, trust eroded. Families pleaded for them to seek help. But help meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant admitting the league had broken them. Many players refused, believing they were supposed to be invincible, believing any sign of weakness was a betrayal. The pills stole more than health. They stole presence, warmth, clarity, connection. Loved ones watched helplessly as addiction hollowed out the person inside the uniform. Some families eventually left, unable to withstand the emotional wreckage. Others stayed, fighting alongside the player, holding them together when the league would not. This was the hidden tragedy, the one never shown in highlight reels or documentaries, the quiet suffering behind the spectacle. A crisis not just of bodies, but of homes. White heavy checkmark. As awareness grew, the league shifted its narrative, crafting press releases that hinted at reform without ever acknowledging blame. They spoke of player safety, of updated protocols, of new research partnerships designed to reassure the public, while keeping the deeper truths buried. They promoted wellness initiatives that looked good on paper, but changed little in practice. Players noticed the disconnect, how the league talked about safety, while the culture still praised the ones who pushed through pain. Every season brought a new wave of injuries, a new crop of broken bodies, a new generation learning the unwritten rule: your value is tied to your availability. Behind closed doors, executives debated how much transparency would damage the brand, how much accountability they could afford to accept. They knew the truth. Exposure meant lawsuits, lawsuits meant payouts, and payouts meant admitting that the league's foundation was built on the suffering of the very athletes who made it profitable. The machine was too big, too valuable, too entrenched to be derailed by morality. So reforms came slowly, strategically, superficially. A helmet redesign here, a concussion protocol update there. Changes meant to show progress, without challenging the system itself. And while the public applauded, players kept limping, kept hurting, kept depending on the same substances that had fueled the sport. For decades, the problem persisted, hidden beneath the polished image of America's favorite game. White heavy checkmark whistleblowers emerged from unexpected corners. Trainers, retired players, anonymous staffers, who could no longer tolerate the silence. They shared stories of pressure campaigns, of medical staff instructed to downplay injuries, of executives who discouraged documentation to avoid legal liability. Some revealed that team doctors were pressured to expedite returns, even when MRIs told a different story. Others described secret stashes of medication kept ready for players who needed a last-minute boost to make it through the game. A few remembered players collapsing after the final whistle, their bodies spent, their systems overloaded. From painkillers and adrenaline, the whistleblowers paid a price. Some were fired, others blacklisted, many labeled as disloyal. The league framed them as disgruntled employees or outliers with personal agendas. But their testimonies painted a consistent picture, a culture where winning justified everything, where player health was secondary, where silence was expected. Their voices cracked the facade, but the league's influence was powerful, shaping public opinion and controlling the narrative. Still, the truth leaked through, and the world began to see what players had known. For years, the system was never designed to protect them. In the aftermath, players looked back with a mixture of pride and regret. Pride for what they achieved, regret for what it cost. Some managed to recover, rebuilding their lives after leaving the sport. Others continued to struggle, caught between addiction, chronic pain, and the emotional scars left by years of pushing their bodies beyond their limits. A few never escaped, their stories ending in tragedy, lost careers, broken families, or lives cut short. The league moved on quickly, as it always does, celebrating new stars, new seasons, new records. But the shadows remained, etched into the history of every locker room, every sideline, every stadium. This scandal was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a machine built on human sacrifice, a reminder that glory often hides suffering, that heroes are sometimes casualties of the very system they fueled. As fans, we cheer the spectacle, rarely seeing the hidden costs. But behind every touchdown, every highlight, every moment of triumph, lies a truth the league would rather forget. Football is beautiful, but its darkness is undeniable. And until the system changes, until transparency replaces silence, the cost will continue to fall on the players who give everything for the game. This is their story, the story the NFL never wanted you to hear. And if you want to stay ahead of every dark chapter in football history, subscribe and turn on notifications. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming.